Hey, History 201. This is your last lecture of the semester. And, before I say anything else, I hope that this class has done you some good. I hope you've picked up some historical information. I hope you've learned some stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what college is about. You want to come out knowing more than you did coming in. And I hope that was the case for you. Well, anyway, the last lecture I'm talking about corresponds with chapter 24 in both of your books, and also corresponds with a film that I have placed on your coursework. Uh, that is the first episode of Eyes on the Prize, a documentary series that came out, oh gosh, maybe about 30 years ago now, and was run on PBS. It was about the civil rights movement. And anyway, the film that I'm showing you all, that film that I assigned you all, deals with the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's looking at the period from about 1954 to 1956. And so this is the beginning of the civil rights movement. Now, first of all, we need to talk about America in the 1950s. You know, when the last assignment I gave you all dealt with the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression hung on for a very long time, from 1929 until World War One. The World War One is what brought America out of the Great Depression, because America had to mobilize for the war and ended up putting everybody to work, virtually everybody to work. The economy grew because America not only supplied itself, it also supplied the Western world, because America ended up being the one major industrial country that was not that did not have its industrial capacity negatively impacted by World War II. It was, the only part of America that really got bombed significantly was Hawaii, and Hawaii, to this day, is not a industrial state. It's a state that is primarily about tourism, and also a strategic location in relation to Asia, which is why the Japanese bombed it. I mean, they wanted to weaken the United States naval forces before the war. But the bottom line, I don't want to get too deep into that. The bottom line is that America came out of World War II with a very strong industrial capacity. Matter of fact, the United States at the end of World War II had 75% of the industrial capacity in the entire world. And so what this meant was that in the period after World War II, America was far and away the richest country in the world. And Americans really did well. Uh, Income went way up. Employment was very, very high. Uh, and also, there had been a lot of pent up demand. I mean, the country had gone through a depression that was over 10 years long. It had gone through 4 years of World War. And so that was, like I said, it's like a 14, 15-year period of deprivation. And so this meant that once the war was over, everybody was doing really well. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, World War II is really interesting, because one of the interesting concepts that developed in the run up to World War II and went on through World War II was really, this was the first time you really have an articulation of the idea of racism. Racism was something that was a word that was initially used to describe the policies of Hitler. Now, the great irony of Hitler, however, is that Hitler actually cited the United States as a role model. When Hitler created the Nuremberg laws in 1935 that discriminated against Jewish people, he used segregation laws in America that were aimed primarily at African Americans as an example. There were literally Nazi researchers who came to America to read how to do segregation laws. And that's not the only time it happened in American history. I mean, South Africa did the same thing a little bit earlier, where they sent people to the Library of Congress to read to figure out how to do segregation laws, since America was a pioneer in that field. And what we see is that during World War II, some of the contradictions in America really became obvious. There were stories, for instance, of Nazi war criminals who, once they were captured and brought to places like St. Louis or to Arkansas or Texas, because they were white, once they became trustees, once they became trusted prisoners, they could go places and do things that black GIs, the guys who captured them sometimes, when they got to America, they could go places and they could do things that black soldiers could not do. And there was a great deal of criticism of racial policies in America. As a matter of fact, World War One itself, brought about some changes because, before the war ever started, there was discrimination against hiring black workers in defense plants. And so what happened was that black leaders, began to talk about having a march on Washington. And Roosevelt was able to shut that down by issuing a executive order that promised that there would be no discrimination in defense hiring. And the executive order worked pretty well. I mean, obviously, all discrimination did not end. No law ever completely gets rid of a problem, but it did make a difference. And so we have a situation after the war where you have a new president. Franklin Roosevelt dies in 1945, a few months before the war ends. He dies in April 1945. The Germans are defeated in May of 1945. The Japanese are defeated in August of 1945. And so you have a new president, President Harry Truman from Missouri. And, it's under Truman that, it's through Truman's orders that the atomic bombs are dropped on Japan. And it's really interesting because Truman is from Missouri. He's from Independence, out western Missouri, outside of Kansas City. And, Missouri is kind of an interesting state. Missouri is not really a southern state, but it was a very much a southern influence state, and also very much a segregationist state. And Truman had been raised in a family that was pro-Confederate. He grew up in kind of a segregationist tradition. But to the surprise of a lot of people, once Truman became president, he actually pushed for civil rights. And he integrated the military, which was a big thing. And in the 1948 Democratic Convention, he made it clear that he supported the civil rights plank. And because of this, Southern politicians led by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who at the time was governor of South Carolina, and he would live to be 100 years old, and he would continue to be a major political influence in South Carolina until the year 2000. He eventually passed around about that time. But anyway, Southern politicians under the leadership of Strom Thurmond had they splintered from the Democratic Party, and they formed what became known as the Dixiecrat Party. And they had a nominating convention in Birmingham, Alabama. And so we end up with Strom Thurmond being the Dixiecrat nominee for president. And the Dixiecrats end up doing pretty well during the election. They pick off a number of deep southern states, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia. A number of states in the deep south end up voting for the Dixiecrats, Louisiana. And, it appears that Truman would lose, but he ends up winning the election. Now, the bottom line is that, you had the integration of the military. Jackie Robinson integrates baseball. The NBA becomes integrated. A lot of people don't realize the NBA, the first couple of years was segregated. Was not segregated, did not allow blacks at all. But eventually it becomes integrated. The NFL was kind of an anomaly. It had integrated earlier. Matter of fact, the very first NFL coach was in the 1920s. A lot of people don't realize that. There was a very famous player coach in the 1920s. But the bottom line is that black athletes, have become common in team sports. Prior to this, the only black athletes you really saw were in individual sports. Boxers. People like Joe Louis, or a generation before him, Jack Johnson. Uh, but team sports tended to be segregated. That's why you had a Negro League and these sorts of things. And so therefore, you begin to see this movement towards integration. In entertainment, people like Sidney Poitier become stars. Now, at the same time we see these things going on, there were also some other changes going on too. Now, first of all, if you all remember a month or so back, I talked about the situation in Elaine, Arkansas, which eventually resulted in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund winning an appeal, and they were able to get the sharecroppers off of death row. They were able to become free. Well, the NAACP never went away. The Legal Defense Fund never went away. And it kept chipping away and winning legal cases. I mean, there was a famous legal case in 1936 in Missouri, for instance, where the NAACP won the case to integrate Mizzou's law school. Now, in that case, the poor young man who was going to be the first black student at the law school disappeared. To this day, nobody ever knows what happened to him. I mean, I kind of got a pretty good idea what happened, but we don't know officially. But the bottom line is that the NAACP had gradually been winning legal cases. And the government overall was beginning to move in a different direction. And also, it's important to understand that internationally, things had changed. There had been a movement away from colonialism. I mean, a number of colonial countries like India and Indonesia had gotten their independence. Egypt got its independence. China, which was not really a colony, but had been, what you would call kind of a neo-colonial situation where other countries came in and controlled lots of aspects of it, even though it was not a colony. They managed to get their independence. And so, there was no longer the great support behind colonialism. The idea, what had been referred to as the white man's burden, the idea that whites would rule the world and they would lift up inferior people. That was going away. And so what we see is that you have the development of these independent countries, and this becomes what becomes known as the third world. The movement of countries that had been colonized towards independence. Now, the other thing that's really significant too is that America ends up as the richest country in the world, the most industrialized country in the world, but the other country that ends up being a major power is the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, is a Marxist country. It's a country that system is based on communism. And what we see is that the Soviet Union, which was still led by Joseph Stalin, they had been, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, they were the big allies during the war. But when the war was over, Stalin, he did not trust the Western countries. And, he had reason not to trust the Western countries. I mean, because after all, the Western countries were perfectly happy to let Hitler fight him. Now, the flip side of it, of course, is that he had an underhand deal with Hitler too. But, he did not trust the Western countries. And so as soon as as soon as the war was over, he began plotting to get control of Eastern Europe. And also, the Soviets began to influence countries outside of Europe. Now, the Soviets had always had a great deal of influence in Asia. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party had a Soviet impact, going back to the 1920s. And so what we see is that by 1949, the Communist Party in China, the people, wins the civil war between them and the Chinese nationalist movement, known as the Kuomintang. They defeat them, and so in 1949 you have the People's Republic of China, and so you have the Cold War. But one of the things that the Soviets could really beat up on America about was that, Americans said, America's a free country, we believe in democracy, we believe in individual rights. And the Soviets said, yeah, you believe in individual rights. What about all these black people that can't vote? What about these black people who get lynched if they have a negative interaction with a white person, who get thrown in jail, who are openly discriminated against in housing and jobs and this sort of thing? And so, really, it's significant that beginning in the 1950s and really increasing in the 1960s is the notion that America, the American leadership began to see segregation and discrimination as a liability. That this was something that would hurt America in its relations with the rest of the world, especially countries that were not run by white people. Because remember, America didn't just have segregation. I mean, remember, America, we didn't talk about this in class, but, America, for instance, they put the Japanese in internment camps, or, which is a nice word to say in concentration camps, during World War II. Basically from the 1880s until the 1960s, it was almost impossible for Asian people to come to America and become citizens, or really anybody who wasn't from Europe. And so, although America talked about freedom, people from Africa and Asia knew that American freedom was not something that everybody in America truly enjoyed. And so the civil rights movement needs to be seen in this context, that the world was changing. And American leadership could no longer really ignore segregation. Segregation had become a really bad liability. It was something that really hurt the American brand. Now, the other thing that's really crucial, and this is something that's really, you will see this especially in the film, the part talking about the bus boycott in Montgomery, or even talking about the death of Emmett Till, is that with television, the ugliness of American discrimination really couldn't be hidden anymore. I mean, there was a time, prior to television, somebody gets lynched. You hear about it, and then, there's maybe a few little pictures that show up somewhere. But once you have television, and you have people protesting against discrimination. Now, I didn't give these films for you, but like for instance, with the integration of the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, for instance, you see crowds of thousands of white Southerners, beating up on 9 black students, beating up on black reporters. In 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, you see the Birmingham Police Department, the Birmingham Fire Department, sicking police dogs on demonstrators, or taking fire hoses that are so strong they knock the bark off trees, and knocking down kids with them. And so, what this means is that with media, America could no longer, really hide discrimination. It was out there. And, this is something that we still deal with today. I mean, a lot of you all remember the summer when you had the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And, it really upset a lot. A lot of people who normally are very strong police supporters, when they saw an 8-minute video of a police officer with his knee on a man's neck while he's saying he can't breathe, begging him to take his knee off his neck. That's the kind of thing you can't defend. I mean, a lot of police departments, a lot of police union leaders who normally never, ever, ever criticize police in killings came out against this. And so we really first see the influence of media in the 1950s once television becomes common. And it just simply becomes stronger and stronger throughout the 1960s. And so, if you really want to look at the issue of civil rights, why did civil rights become successful? Uh, as I said, first of all, America becomes a richer society. It has more money. You have more, and then also another thing that I didn't mention, you simply have a lot more black people living outside of the South. There was a time when southern states were majority black. But really by 1940, there are no more majority black southern states. I mean, South Carolina and Louisiana stopped being majority black around 1930 or so. Mississippi stopped being majority black around 1940. So therefore, if black people did get the vote in those states, they were no longer in a position to take over as they would have been, after the Civil War. That makes a difference. On the flip side, however, you also have a lot more black people living in the North where they can vote. And so this means that northern politicians, they really can't ignore the black vote in Chicago or Detroit or New York or Philadelphia, Cleveland, St. Louis, or Los Angeles. That, the Cold War, the competition for influence in the third world, excuse me, and the fact that you have international media that exposed discrimination in a way that it never had before really meant that America could no longer stand by and just let discrimination happen. Now, on top of this, you have the NAACP, which had been in court for decades, winning cases. And eventually in 1954, the NAACP will win Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed school segregation and really undermined segregation in general. And so with all of these factors involved, it's not surprising that the civil rights movement really begins to pick up in the 1950s throughout the 1960s. Anyway, this is a short little lecture. I hope this helps you with your final essay.